for joining for the afternoon session. We've got a tight time frame here and a lot to discuss. My name is Andy Critchlow. I'm head of news in EMEA at S&P Global Commodity Insight. I'm delighted to be joined by Mike McGlone, Senior Commodity Strategist at Bloomberg Intelligence, Sarah Baxter, founder and president of SVB Energy International, and Dr. Anas Al-Haji, Managing Partner, Energy Outlook Advisors. And we're here this afternoon to discuss the subject of what is the outlook for US supermajors joining the energy transition in 2023. And I guess, the big kind of elephant in the room to discuss first is what does a Republican controlled House of Representatives mean for supermajors if they want to get into energy transition? Is it going to be beneficial? Is it going to be a roadblock? What significance does that have? Mike, if I can go to you first with that question.
It's generally positive, and I think that's part of the pendulum swinging. We saw the extremes of Democratic leadership pushing back on free markets and drilling and federal lands, and we're pushing back the other way a little bit, which is a good thing about one of the nice things about the pendulum in U.S. politics. So it's generally a good thing for supply. And it was a good shock for people to realize how important fossil fuels are. But that's what I've been impressed with in some ways, how we had a bit of a bipartisan agreement with the Inflation Reduction Act, focus on renewables, yes, and fossil fuels. Now, there's a lot more to do there, but compared to places like Europe and New York State, U.S. is definitely pushing that way. But for me, that's probably our other panelists' focus. My focus is less on the actual equities and more on the underlying commodities. And the big picture I like to say is the thing the majors are facing and everybody's facing is this pendulum swinging in commodities the other way. We got to those extremes last year. What does that prove? That producers are always the best place to be, not the actual commodity, because they produce. Commodities are dumb, people are smart. And the key thing I want to end with is what's happened lately, and what you're seeing now is this downward revision trend in global economic growth. The latest from the World Bank, this says cuts its 2023 forecast and warns of global recession. That's nothing new. That's clearly the trend. And the head, David Malpass's quote was, "Urgent global action is needed to mitigate the risks of global recession and debt distress." That basically also means Federal Reserve and central bank easing, and they're still tightening. So what I see is a very bad environment for commodities this year. Maybe producers will do okay, but actual commodities just rotating back and doing the opposite of last year. They got too expensive, and now it's a question of how cheap they'll go. With that, I pass it back to you.
So, Dr. Anas, if I can come to you next, from your perspective, do you see, this change in control of the House of Representatives having any significance? Of course, GOP, traditionally more aligned to the interests of fossil fuel producers, arguably in the US. The Biden administration has tried to pursue more pro-energy transition policies. It's debatable how successful that has been at this point. What's your perspective?
Sure. First, I agree with Mike on commodities, and that's what we had in our recent outlook that we released a couple of days ago on the oil market in 2023. So we have some serious problems in terms of commodity. But here is the situation. I am here in Texas, and literally I am sitting above a shale play right now. And irrespective of politics in Washington, the industry basically is going its way no matter what. And the reason why, because companies do not like the flip-flop of politics in Washington. They cannot invest. You're not going to see a major oil company looking at prospect a 30-year project in the Gulf of Mexico, looking at the 4-year politics. This is longer term. You look at producers when the life of wells is short, but for the company, they're looking at the next 20, 30 years. So they have their own things, and they are usually ahead of the game. So if they know that the government is going to impose some environmental regulations, okay, we are going to go for it, but please do not flip on me later. We have enough evidence to show that even when the Biden administration tried to help consumers by allowing refineries to produce more, by relaxing some environmental regulations, refiners oppose that. It's not in their interest to do so. It does cost money too. So the industry, basically, irrespective of politics in Washington, is going in a certain way. On the other side, we have to seriously pay attention to the carbon calculations, because I think this is the mother of all Enrons. And the reason why, just look at the news today. Shell is thinking about divesting from Norway. What does that mean? Well, once they divest from Norway, their carbon footprint shrinks. Someone else is buying those assets, which means that from a global point of view, there is no change. So even if we end up with a democratic government that is on the extreme left, and they impose all kinds of regulations, the companies are going to play the game. We've seen companies, basically, I've been working on this for the last 3 years, and we've seen companies literally counting trees on their campuses in their carbon plant. And these are 100-year-old trees. We've seen governments that, we've seen companies that shrank their offices because of COVID and working from home, claiming that space that is not occupied anymore, claiming it in their carbon footprint. So companies basically are playing all kinds of games. We have a behavior we call the scavenger behavior. The scavenger behavior basically is literally the management of the companies are telling them, look, go find what we've been doing green for a long time so we can incorporate that as a credit. Literally, Walmart has been green for the last 30 years. Why?
So if I can just interrupt you there, Dr. Anas, it seems like the picture that you're painting is, policy formulated in Washington's going in one direction. The supermajors, obviously, they have to be seen to comply, but actually, behind the scenes, they're doing something very different, which is they're doing what they have done for a long time. They've done very well, which is develop assets, deploy capital, develop fossil fuel resources when they can.
Right.
Sarah, if I come to you, do you see that dynamic? How do you see that dynamic playing out? And given the messaging, at least that we've seen from European oil majors towards energy transition, whether this is decarbonisation, whether it's carbon storage and capture, whether it is re-gearing their businesses more towards energy transition, solar, effectively becoming utilities. When you look at the likes of Total Energies and Shell and BP, for that example, are the US supermajors playing catch up there?
Yes, of course. I like to catch upon what Anas said about the correlation between the policies in Washington, D.C. and the strategies of companies. They're obviously looking at the economy of their business. And they are, since COVID, they are more capital disciplined. But as we are moving with higher service costs, higher contractor costs, they are having different approach. So if suddenly the administration change its policy, short-term policy, and is encouraging or demanding companies to produce more, they're not going to overnight produce more or produce less. They are looking at their well productivity, their service contractors, cost of production, and also they have their own outlooks and forecasts of prices in the years to come. So if administration is encouraging them to produce more for filling the SPR at $70 per barrel, they might not see that necessarily economically beneficial to ramp up their production. They would obviously invest more on carbon capture and also, as again was mentioned, reducing their carbon footprint. But one of the major, and I would say dangerous consequence of what Anna said is that when most of these major companies come out of some of those projects that are more emitting in terms of carbon footprint, these projects would be left for smaller companies and companies that afford to purchase these leftover projects, and they have they're poorly managed in compared to more major companies in terms of reducing those carbon footprints. So while we see that most of these majors are moving forward to reducing their carbon footprint, to exiting from some of these projects are left for those smaller companies that they cannot take care of these projects in terms of clean environment or decarbonization. So that's, I would say, a very negative consequence of this movement.
So Sarah, if I can just throw this now over to Mike. I mean, one of the themes that I hear repeatedly from IOC executives here in Europe is this concern about investors and shareholder concern regards the speed at which they're re-gearing their businesses towards energy transition. We've heard executives in some of the major oil companies in Europe really concerned about the allocation of funds, shareholder capital to their companies. Based on this, a lot of funds now won't invest in oil companies. A lot of the pension funds here in Europe won't invest in oil companies. How does that look on across the water in the US? Is this the same amount of anxiety with the likes of ExxonMobil, Chevron, when it comes to their shareholder base?
There is. I think it's a little more extreme in Europe, and Europe learned the lessons of banning fracking and horizontal drilling, and what happens when you get dicey sources of fuel that don't provide that fossil fuel anymore, i.e. the invasion of Russia. So I think that's tilting back a little bit. It's what Sarah mentioned and Anais mentioned too, is okay, so we've seen some divesting of the majors, but there's hundreds of independent oil and energy companies in this country, and they don't care as much about the ESG factors. And having owned a farm myself, when you own the land and you can produce a lot of revenue from it, you're going to find ways to do that. And to me, that's the key thing to remember about what's happening in this paradigm shift of U.S. becoming the world's largest energy producer and a net exporter over the last 10 years. Most of it was during the Obama administration. It was not quite favorable. It's just that rapidly advancing technology. So I was just, as we're speaking, I was watching a chat and the energy chat, the Bloomberg energy chat, and they were debating about, I was surprised that this happened so fast. The switch in Europe and how Germany was able to bring on LNG in 200 days and typically take 200 months and things like that. That's just the trend. I mean, how did the world bring on vaccines in a couple of years when typically it took many years, and took months? So that's, to me, is what's happening in this space, is this advancing technology happening so fast.
So just to pause you there, are you saying that the transformation we're seeing, and you're picking up on what Sarah said and Anas, that actually the super majors in the US, and partly due to energy transition, they've had their day. The industry's getting, in a way, lots of smaller operators, smaller individuals who own land. It's more fragmented. It's more broken down. These entities, they're less interested in what shareholders might think. They may be privately owned in a lot of cases. The last 100 years of the oil industry in the US and Europe has been dominated by these gigantic international oil companies that have been buttressed by shareholder participation that's provided the capital. That's had its day now, and energy transition is changing. Is that what you're saying? Are we seeing the end of super majors in that sense?
I'm saying don't ignore the rules of Adam Smith in The Invisible Hand. And that's what, when people point out these little trees, it's the forest that matters. And the fact is that the average cost of production in the U.S. for a barrel of crude oil is $40 a barrel. Just 6-7 years ago was $70 a barrel. Natural gas, the average cost is $2 per MMBTU, and then the price on the screen is double that. That's just, and there's an excess of supply, and it's just coming on. There's a great place to export it. So I look at it as, that's the macro. I focus on the macro, expect that to continue. And I do warn, I did when people were talking for $100 crude oil last year, I said it's going to 50. And here's why. It always has when it spikes at that propensity, because the key thing to remember about crude oil is because of the propensity and ability to produce more. And it's the key thing that I'll leave you with is that elasticity of supply and demand forces are greater than ever. And focusing on things like ESG misses the point of the macro. Like I like to point out, is I have an electric car. Peak production and peak consumption in this country happened almost 20 years ago, and production is just starting to take off. You include Canada, you add that price incentive. Where is all that crude oil coming from? I look at the macro and see the invisible hand.
So building on that invisible hand narrative, I'm going to throw this to you, Dr. Anas. And playing devil's advocate here, in the UK, the government has set a target of net zero by 2050. We have COP28 this year in the UAE. Undoubtedly, there'll be more pledges. Will they be achieved? Again, questionable. What's the US's carbon footprint going to look like in 2050?
Generally speaking, when we say net zero, that concept fits with what I said earlier, that carbon accounting is the mother of all enrons, because all you got to do just keep the two sides of the equation in neutral, which means that carbon could go through the roof. You are just trying to compensate for that in some way. But policymakers, whether in the US or Europe, are having some serious problems, and they are causing some serious damage. To give you some examples, look at the UK, for example, and those ideas basically being circulated here in the United States. They, at the same time, when they want to kill the oil industry, they want the oil. At the same time, they don't want the fossil fuel, they are adding more. But the issue here is, it is the oil companies that are building the largest wind farms in the world. It is the oil industry that is doing the renewables. And now in the UK, they impose the excise profit tax, the windfall profit tax on the oil companies. What was the response of the oil companies? They were building, one company was building a very large wind farm. They stopped because they said, you took my money and therefore I'm not going to invest in this renewable project that you are encouraging me to do. And we've seen companies basically just leaving. Today in our Substack, we are releasing an article on the price control of natural gas in the EU. And if you look at it, what they are doing with the price cap is literally telling ICE, which is the exchange in London, they are telling them, do not work with natural gas. What the ICE did, they threatened that they are going to withdraw all their operations from Europe completely. Trading operations, they are going to go somewhere else. So the governments are going in a way where the businesses are going somewhere else. And these ideas of price caps, I'm not talking about the Russian price cap. I'm talking about the natural gas price cap within the EU. Let's talk about the subsidies for oil and for gasoline and diesel. What they are doing, they are literally subsidizing fossil fuel that is causing the climate change. So where we are going with these policies?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. And I'll come to you, Sarah, now, with that. I mean, where do you go with these policies? The world still needs energy. Even the most conservative estimates, don't see peak oil, before 2040 in terms of demand. And, again, that's very questionable whether it will even come at that point. The fundamentals underpinning commodities are a growing global population, going from 8 billion to 10 billion by 2050 and beyond, and energy has powered economic development and growth globally. That is an immutable fact over the last 100 years and beyond. But the other side of this is climate change, and climate change that has a devastating impact on people's lives, whether that is rising temperatures, rising sea levels, water scarcity. We've discussed some of these issues earlier today. Does the US, which, according to best estimates, has one of the highest per capita CO2 footprints in the world, higher than China, higher than India per capita, does it want to be the pariah? And do US supermajors want to be seen as underpinning that pariah status as a global emitter of CO2, given all these climate change risks?
Well, obviously, no one denies the environmental impacts of all this energy demanded and consumption that we have, and the need for change in the consumption trends, and also what we are using. Something that is very important is, at least after the Russian war, and because of the lack of investment, the world kind of got a sense of global energy crisis, which also led to food crisis. So it's just very complicated. We all are worried about energy security, energy and water and affordability of the energy prices, and also food security, because they're all connected together. But something that I think, I don't know, there's not either enough study done on that, or maybe not enough publicly available studies, is that when we're talking about net zero, at least in the United States, to reach the goal, we need to increase our renewable power generation 3 times annually. We need to increase the mined mineral content by 6 times. What are the environmental consequences of mining? What are the environmental consequences of changing all of this infrastructure? Is it possible or not? And also, we are looking that by 2040, we're going to need 50 times more batteries. Thinking about recycling these batteries, thinking about producing. So there are again, little publicly available studies done that shows that for many of these renewables, at least with the current technologies, we might look at the acceleration and new technologies that we don't have currently in our hand. But with what is available today, the amount of energy is used for mining and producing this renewable energy, and amount of energy that we need to retire and recycle these batteries or solar panels is more than the energy that these renewable facilities produce during their life cycle.
So it's again, it's this story that we're seeing playing out around the world is how do you actually provide those resources for energy?
How we provide
it, metals, how do you provide the energy, the resources as a whole for growing populations and growing economic development and growth through that period. So let's bring it back to now, 2023. China now has abandoned its lockdown policy with regards to COVID, opening up flights, more movement. It's going to be a bumpy ride to see how that goes into the first quarter, second quarter. But there is this expectation we're going to get a gradually accelerating demand throughout the year. What does that mean for shale, Mike, in the US?
Well, I do love the hopium about China, because it's what the bulls are hanging on, and the ones who expected us to go above 150. It's the problem is China incremental demand, economic GDP growth, demand pull for commodities has been in decline for almost a decade, and it's really plunging now. And it's not China anymore, it's one person. If you're investing in China, you need to assess the personality and nuances of Mr. Z. That's what's changed in the world definitely compared to Deng, when China was coming out of poverty, and now it's stuck in this world of the world's heading towards recession. The world's largest exporting economy is having a battle with the world's largest importing economy as the property crisis accelerates. And from some of our Bloomberg economic measures, there's another 25% to drop in property crisis in China. So to me, China is a combination right now of peak Japan and peak Soviet Union about 30 years ago. And good luck with, we all know what happens with autocratic regimes and free flow of capital and free markets. So maybe incremental demand pull for China crude oil imports bump back up around to 12 million barrels a day. It's been hovering between 10 and 12 million barrels a day. The excess of crude oil, liquid fuel supply versus demand in the US and Canada is about 4 million barrels a day. And that's accelerating because of price and technology and declining consumption. The key thing I also like to point out with China is they've been cutting their RRR rate and trying to stimulate the economy forever. And if you want an estimated GDP in China, you have to go right to the central government, seeing what they're doing to do that. It's not organic anymore, and it's actually tilting negative. So
Mike, yeah. if I stop you there, don't hang your hat on China. This is the message for the bulls in that shale play in the US. Dr. Anas, the US economy though is looking better, right? The Fed may be on the brink of pausing rate rises. You've got corporate bond issuance starting to pick up again because people are starting to think, hey, we've got this inflationary story a little bit under control. The economic picture in the US much brighter than Europe, and you've got a new source of demand that's opening up in Europe because all that Russian crude now heading to Asia at a massive discount under the cap. And there's this expectation we're going to see more US barrels coming into the Atlantic Basin, more US barrels coming into the US. What are the shale drillers doing about it?
Just one thing, look at the U.S. yield curve. The U.S. is clearly heading to a recession. Our economics team said it's almost 100%, and the Federal Reserve is still tightening. Virtually every central bank on the planet is still tightening. That means as I started this intro, we're probably going to get much weaker economic
the U.S.
growth.
is still adding jobs. The U.S. is still adding jobs. And sat here in Europe,
the Fed will change
Europe's
that.
a much bleaker picture. So, yeah, Dr. Anas, what's your view on that? Because certainly here in Europe, a hole's opened up in the market that was previously being filled by Urals. Are we going to see these shale drillers respond and more American barrels flowing into this market? You're on mute, Dr. Anas.
I would answer your question in a minute. I just want to go back to your point on emissions. When you look at Biden's foreign policy, you look at Biden's economic policy, what you find is that the increase in emissions was the result of the foreign policy and the economic policy, because otherwise we would have been flat or lower emissions without those policies. The foreign policy raised natural gas prices substantially, and some utilities basically in the United States switched to coal, and that's what increased CO2 emissions. And then if you look at the SPR release, what the SPR release did, basically it lowered oil prices and maintained the demand as is almost in the United States, and increased for some products. That increased emissions. If he did not use the SPR, if he did not divert the gas to Europe, we would not have that increase in emissions. So it's very easy to change that based on foreign policy and economic policy.
So we've dealt with that emissions issue. So for 2023, though, based on our assessments at S&P Global Commodity Insights, you haven't seen the volume of US barrels we may have expected come in to substitute, replace lost barrels from Russia, Urals in Europe, in that Atlantic Basin market. Do you see that changing in 2023? Because it's hard to see Russia coming back into the European market anytime soon.
Well, generally speaking, in our outlook, by the way, I know this takes a lot of time. In our outlook, we discussed this in details. The issue here is we are not going to see a major decline in Russian exports. We are going to see a diversion. Russian oil is going to reach the United States. Russian oil is going to reach Europe in one way or the other. As for shale producers basically have a serious problem. And that problem is condensates. They are producing a lot of NGLs that is counted as oil. In fact, this was the subtitle of our outlook. It's pay attention to the crude quality, because most of the increase in shale production is really NGLs, but it's counted for various reasons. It's counted as crude. So the problem is US exports are not going to continue increasing simply because we are getting, or refiners do not want that type of crude, especially now Iran and Nigeria are producing, and Libya are producing more of the same NGLs.
So to come to you, Sarah, last word here, because we're a little bit over time. And I think that you allude to this, Dr. Anas, you look at OPEC, it's only really the core Gulf states that have got any spare capacity, any ability to really increase production. Other OPEC countries, the African producers, really struggling to even hit their quotas, never mind actually increase. If we do need more oil in 2023, is that going to come from shale? Are we going to see a new boom in US oil production like we saw 10 years ago?
No, because US shale producers are not responding to the prices as fast and quick as they used to do. And it's going to, again, as I said, if they wanted to increase their production, they have to call all the contractors, service contractors. Their cost will go higher because they will obviously be charged higher, 30-40% by these subcontractors. There is a supply chain issue. So by the time the equipment that they need to be built for additional supply that you are saying, and that the result being showed, it might take a year or two. So we are not seeing that quick response from shale that could quickly, I don't know, it's not like Saudi Arabia that they decide. And even shale producers production is not responding as fast as they used to higher oil prices. They are more, as I said, capital discipline and more cautious. But also, this is the story of oil. If you look at the story of natural gas production, the shale in US, because of the lower well productivity, many of the producers have ordered for lower production. So as we might see, we might not feel the effect in 2023 because of recession, lower demand, but we might see prices start going higher next year in 2024 because of this reason.
Thanks, Sarah. That's the last word there. I think it's very poignant, in a world of such volatility, so much, geopolitics, so many moving parts, debate over recessions, economic growth, China coming out of lockdowns. Very difficult to forecast and to pin down exactly where we're heading. I think caution seems to be the watchword that I've taken from my participation in the forum today. We've gone over it slightly. We were given 25 minutes. We've squeezed out 30. Getting every last drop out of the barrel there. Thanks so much, Dr. Anas, for your participation. Mike, thank you. Sarah, thank you. You've been great. Thank you.
Thank you.